At the age of 52, Ichiro Suzuki still stands silently in the middle of an empty baseball field like a monument that will never fall, a living symbol whose mere mention is enough to make both continents America and Japan bow their heads. His life spans feats that seem impossible for a human being. The first Japanese outfielder to dare step into MLB and dominate it. The only rookie of the century to win both Rookie of the Year and MVP in the same season. The owner of 262 hits in a single season. An immortal record that has stood firm for nearly 2 decades. The man with 10 consecutive seasons, surpassing 200 hits. An achievement that even the proudest geniuses can only sigh at in the face of its impossibility. In total, more than 4,367 hits across both continents, surpassing even Pete Rose, if counting his entire professional career, leading many experts to admit that Ichiro is not just a baseball player, he is a physical phenomenon, a natural anomaly, a warrior so resilient that people wonder what his body is made of. He changed the way Americans view Asian athletes, paving the way for the generation of Shohei Ohtani, Yu Darvish, and dozens of other Japanese talents. But behind that blinding spotlight lies a dark world that few have the courage to look straight into, because each legendary hit was built upon a childhood so harsh it bordered on cruelty, where his father turned young Ichiro into a training machine with no days off, upon years in America filled with loneliness, when he wasn't fluent in English, had no close friends, no family by his side, living like a silent shadow who ate alone, trained alone, and returned to a cold, empty room alone. Upon physical pain that lasted throughout 28 years, from microscopic muscle tears to a spine that felt like it would snap every time he bent down to tie his shoelaces, upon a lasting marriage without children, so that every night when the lights went out, a silent heaviness filled the void. Upon separation from the father who shaped him with extreme strictness, the man from whom he craved a single word of praise but carried into old age only regrets. And above all, upon the feeling of never being good enough that haunted him his entire life, even when the world called him a legend. Tonight, as Ichiro stands alone in the empty stadium, the wind blowing through his graying hair, people only see serenity. But deep inside is a heart that has endured too much pain, and a steel will that has kept him standing when everything could have made anyone else collapse long ago. Ichiro Suzuki's childhood had no laughter, no afternoons running wild in the streets like other kids, no comforting hugs whenever the boy felt tired or scared. That childhood was sealed with the sound of a baseball hitting the ground, with wheezing breaths after every long run, with the disappointed frowns of his father, Nobuyuki Suzuki, who turned his only son into a project that had to succeed at any cost. To outsiders, Ichiro's family appeared warm, disciplined, neat, but inside was a 6-year-old boy forced to push through training sessions that could bring even adults to their knees. Every day, Ichiro's small body was driven to its limits, like a machine programmed with no stop button. Under the scorching summer sun, he had to run laps around the park until his legs went numb, until his throat burned and his breathing became ragged, as if he might pass out. While other children went home to cool showers, ice cream, and cartoons on TV, Ichiro had to keep standing in the corner of the field, repeating hundreds of swings until his hands trembled from exhaustion. Sometimes, his tiny fingers turned red and blistered from friction, but the only response he got from his father was an icy command: keep going. There were pitching sessions that went on until his skin bled. Ichiro stood in front of a wall, throwing until his wrist throbbed. His shoulder felt torn, but he gritted his teeth and endured, because in his young heart there was always one fear: fear of disappointing his father, fear of not being good enough, fear that any love, if it existed, would be withdrawn the moment he stopped trying. The shattering moments of his childhood didn't come from the harsh training itself. but from the emptiness in his heart. Watching friends laugh and play on the schoolyard, Ichiro could only stand at a distance, silently observing, his hands still fiddling with a baseball, as if it were the lock chaining his entire life. He didn't dare run over, didn't dare ask to join, because he knew it was time for practice, and his father was waiting. Every night, lying in his small room, Ichiro heard his father pacing in the kitchen below, heard the muttered reprimands like invisible verdicts. You have to try harder. You're not fast enough. You're not good enough. No one in that house ever asked if the boy was tired, sad, or wanted a single day off to just be a child. And Ichiro never dared to ask either. The feeling that no one truly loves me crept into him from those early years, settling into a sorrow that later even the blinding lights of MLB could not erase. It was the sorrow of a child who believed his worth existed only when he made no mistakes. Young Ichiro didn't understand why his father was so cold. He only knew that every time his father shook his head in disappointment, his heart clenched in pain, and every time his father stood silently watching, he trained harder, faster, more precisely, as if each perfect swing could buy the warmth he had never touched. That childhood had no hugs, no "you did great," no moments of father and son bonding like in other families. Ichiro grew up in a world where strictness replaced love, where silence replaced praise, and where success was the only way to prove he deserved to exist. On rainy days, the boy stood in the backyard, continuing to practice under cold drops, with no one running out to shield him with an umbrella, no one telling him he could rest for a bit. Raindrops splashing on his face mixed with tears, but Ichiro always held his head high, because keeping his head up was the only way no one would see he was crying. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of Ichiro's childhood was not his father's harshness, but the complete absence of tenderness. He grew up without ever being truly hugged, without ever being told he was good enough, without ever being loved unconditionally. That void, the void of missing warmth, became a smoldering wound that followed Ichiro into adulthood, a wound that drove him to pursue perfection his whole life, to fear mistakes his whole life, to carry the feeling that he had to do more, be better, be stronger, just to fill the emptiness no one else could see. That childhood didn't just create a great athlete, it created a man carrying pain on his shoulders that was never spoken aloud. And that was the first and deepest tragedy in the life of Ichiro Suzuki. Childhood passed in endless training sessions and long nights, listening to his father's disappointed sighs. But Ichiro still believed that if he just tried a little harder, endured a little more pain, never gave up, then the world out there would open its doors to welcome him. But as he entered his teenage years, he discovered a truth even crueler than those sweat-drenched practices. The world didn't care about his efforts. It only saw a small, slender, ordinary body that no one bothered to notice. Japanese scouts considered the God's eyes of baseball, looked him up and down, and delivered a judgment that nailed itself into his heart. Skinny, small, no future. Just 4 short words, but to a boy who had spent his whole life chasing the shadow of expectation, those words were no different from a death sentence for the dream he had clung to since he first held a bat. Ichiro didn't cry. He was already used to swallowing his tears, but the pain coiled inside him, burning like needles. He couldn't understand why people who had never seen him train could so easily dismiss all the years he had sacrificed. Why did they judge only his outward appearance and not the burning will in his eyes? Being cut from youth team rosters felt like knife cuts going deeper each time. Every time the lineup was posted on the bulletin board, Ichiro stood silently in front of the white sheet, scanning the familiar names, then stopping at the empty space where his name should have been. No one bothered to explain. No one bothered to console him. Others celebrated and laughed, while Ichiro stood still, his hands clenched until they turned white. When he returned home, his father, instead of encouraging him, pushed even harder. to the point where Ichiro no longer knew what his own emotions were. He wasn't allowed to be disappointed, wasn't allowed to stop, wasn't allowed to show weakness. To his father, Ichiro being cut wasn't the scout's fault, it was Ichiro's fault. You're not fast enough. You're not strong enough. You're not focused enough. Those words repeated like the endless hammering of a gavel in the boy's mind. There were evenings when Ichiro sat alone on the porch steps, listening to insects chirping in the night, watching his father's shadow pace in the living room, filled with exhaustion, but not daring to sigh. He felt like an unfinished project in his father's hands, a project his father was determined to turn into a masterpiece, even if it crushed his soul. He began to wonder, if I stop being good, will Dad still need me? That was the most painful question. The more outsiders looked down on him, the harder his father pushed. The more he was cut from lists, the heavier his training became. Ichiro felt he was no longer himself, no longer the boy who dreamed of watching balls soar across the sky, but merely a product being polished, an object that had to be perfect according to someone else's wishes. In the rare moments he was alone, he would tilt his face to the sky, watch clouds drift by, and wonder why he couldn't be like other kids, free, carefree, unbound by crushing expectations. But then, as always, he lowered his gaze, picked up the bat, and continued swings that stung his palms. This was the first breaking point in Ichiro's life. Not the harsh training, but the feeling of being rejected by the entire world. Dismissed from the start, judged not by talent, but by a small body he couldn't change. From that moment, Ichiro understood that to survive, he couldn't rely on anyone, couldn't wait for recognition from others. The world had slammed its door in his face, so his only choice was to open his own door through blood, through tears, and through a resolve so strong, even he didn't know he possessed it. And so, from the first cuts of youth, a warrior began to form a wounded warrior, forced, belittled, but rising stronger each time he was knocked down. But those very wounds, that pain of rejection, would later become the shadow that followed him throughout his entire life. Stepping into NPB, the place where Japan's legends are forged and where baseball is seen as a national pride, Ichiro thought he had finally found a place to belong. But no, it was not a safe harbor, but another prison larger, brighter, and many times more lonely. His meteoric rise filled the daily newspapers with his name, drew fans to the stadium just to watch him swing, and placed the nation's expectations on those slender shoulders, as if no one else could carry the glory for the Oryx Blue Wave. But as the spotlight on Ichiro grew ever more blinding, the shadows around his life thickened in ways no one could have foreseen. Becoming an NPB star came with pressure that no outsider could truly understand. In Japan, failure in baseball is not just athletic failure. It is cultural failure, a failure of honor, a failure of the national spirit. Every swing Ichiro took was weighed on the scale of expectation. If he performed well, it was his duty. If he made a mistake, it was his sin. Japan had found a new genius, but that genius had to pay with his youth, with days without rest, nights without sleep, a heart that had never tasted being protected by anyone. The media surrounded him like a storm that never dissipated. They waited outside the training facility gates from early morning, watching his every step, scrutinizing his smallest expressions, and writing it all in a way that kept him in the center, even though he never wanted it. No one asked if Ichiro was tired. No one asked if he wanted a completely silent day. No one cared about the 20-year-old young man trying to stay balanced between genius and collapse. The media only wanted one thing: his talent. Just the talent. The human Ichiro was left behind. While his young teammates spent time gathering after games, playing ping-pong, eating late-night snacks, or chatting about the season, Ichiro quietly picked up his bag and returned to his room, turned on the yellow light, sat in front of an old mirror, and checked every wrist movement, swing angle, shoulder rotation, Other people's walls had posters of idols. His were covered with dense notebooks in Japanese, every tiny statistic, every small mistake, every swing he was unsatisfied with. No one understood that obsession. No one understood why an athlete at his peak always saw himself as a loser. But for Ichiro, even the slightest deviation was a sign of decline. He had no close friends, no dinners out to unwind, no romantic dates. Ichiro's life off the field was like an empty room where the sound of his own footsteps was the only noise. Someone once said that the loneliest feeling is being in a crowd, but no one truly knowing who you are. And that was Ichiro's tragedy. When tens of thousands cheered his name, he still felt like he was standing alone. When the media hailed him as a national symbol, he knew they were only praising the Ichiro on the field, not the Ichiro in real life. Every night was the same. After the stadium lights went out, he stayed longer. The vast stadium became dark and cold, the spectator seats silent like an abandoned temple. Ichiro held his bat and walked along the foul line, his breath so thin it sounded like mist. Sometimes he stopped in the middle of the field, looked up at the dome roof, feeling the silence settle over him like a heavy but familiar blanket. That was the only moment in the day when he was truly alone, without being judged, scrutinized, or crushed by expectations. When the lights go out, he once confided, "It's just me and my own breathing." And that was the starkest truth of his glorious years. Ichiro, the man Japan hailed as a hero, was really just a young man trying not to let loneliness swallow him whole. That loneliness didn't come from having no one around, but from having no one close enough to see the wounds in his eyes. The Oryx Blue Wave could turn Ichiro into a legend, but to do so, they needed a piece of his soul, and he gave it without hesitation, because he knew no other way to live. From childhood to young adulthood, Ichiro always had to prove he deserved to exist. NPB only deepened that wound with the cold glow of extreme expectations. Gradually, Ichiro sensed a bitter truth. To become a winning machine, he had to abandon himself. He no longer had time to laugh, to love, to make mistakes, to be weak. There was only practice, competition, effort, and a quiet fear that if he stopped even for one day, everything he had built would vanish. That legend was created not just with talent and discipline, but with the tears of a young man who was never allowed to live like a normal human being. In NPB, Ichiro didn't just defeat every opponent. He also had to defeat loneliness, pressure, fear of failure, and himself. But eventually, even a legend grows exhausted. And the next step in Ichiro's life, when he left Japan for America, would open a chapter of tragedy far deeper, where loneliness became so vast it nearly drowned him. If the years in NPB drained Ichiro's youth, then the flight to America the day he left Japan for Seattle in 2001 took away the last remnants of peace within him. As the plane lifted off, he looked through the small window and saw the sky of the cherry blossom land receding behind like a slow-motion film reel. That place, though full of pressure and loneliness, was still home, still where he understood every breath. But ahead, a completely foreign world awaited him like a final challenge. It was not just a trip, it was a different life, a different version of Ichiro that even he was not ready to face. Upon landing in Seattle, the first thing Ichiro felt was not the excitement of a player entering the world's biggest league, but an invisible chill. No one spoke Japanese. No one understood what he said. No one knew who he really was, beyond the statistics that the skeptical MLB media still looked down on. In their eyes, he was a small Japanese guy, unable to hit MLB's fast pitches, and some reporters even called him an oddity from the East. American culture was open but cold. Americans were direct to the point of cruelty sometimes, while Ichiro came from a culture where emotions were held back behind polite smiles. He didn't know how to talk to his teammates. Whenever they joked in the locker room, he just sat in a corner, silently retying his shoelaces, like a guest who had wandered into a house not meant for him. No friends, no family, no one who understood the language, no one who knew what he liked, feared, or hurt from. Ichiro was like a warrior thrown onto a battlefield without a map. All he had was his bat, glove, and a will honed since childhood. Mornings he ate alone, afternoons he trained alone, evenings he returned to an empty apartment, turned on dim lights, and ate a tasteless dinner he cooked himself. He didn't go to bars, didn't attend parties, didn't play games, didn't hang out. Others looked at him and thought he was different. But no one knew that difference was the last wall he built to keep from collapsing. Even on the field where he should have found connection, Ichiro felt alone. When teammates joked, he only heard noise. When coaches talked strategy, he just tried to understand each word. When reporters asked questions in rapid-fire English, he only smiled politely and answered briefly, to the point of being misunderstood as arrogant. Seattle, the city of rain, fog, and gray afternoons, became the perfect backdrop for his loneliness. It enveloped Ichiro like a damp, cold blanket, making him sometimes wonder what he was doing on this side of the Pacific. There were nights he sat by his small apartment window, watching rain fall on the glass, and longing for the sound of Japanese, missing family, missing a warm home, missing summer afternoons with the smell of earth after rain in Aichi. And he wondered, will this country ever accept me? Or am I just a lost guest? The press kept attacking. He's too small. Strange swing. Japanese baseball isn't good enough. Each word like cold raindrops soaking into his skin. Ichiro didn't react, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just returned to practice, repeating motions until his hands blistered. Shoulders felt torn. Back ached so much he had to lie down for an hour just to breathe. But that was the only thing he knew how to do. Endure. Americans didn't know that his silence wasn't arrogance, but fear of being misunderstood. Not coldness, but the confusion of someone lost. Not indifference, but a loneliness so deep no language could describe it. In those first months in Seattle, people said Ichiro was a mystery, but only he knew. He was slowly breaking apart. This was breaking point number 2 in the life of Ichiro Suzuki. Absolute loneliness amid a sea of people, where the stadium lights blazed bright, where fans cheered endlessly. But Ichiro, amid all that glory, only felt like a lost soul who belonged nowhere in this world. And it was in that very loneliness that a legend was about to rise. But first, Ichiro had to learn to live with the darkness no one else could see. The year 2001, Ichiro's first season in MLB, should have been the dream any athlete would wish for. The biggest stage in the world, the brightest lights, millions of fans following every sprint. But for Ichiro, it was a year where dream and nightmare blended together, intertwined in every game, every hit, every time he stepped onto the field with a heart heavy as stone. 2001 was the year he became a legend, but it was also the year he faced levels of hatred, doubt, and prejudice he had never experienced before. Before the season began, the American press attacked without mercy. How can someone so small do anything? Japanese baseball isn't strong enough. MLB is completely different. He'll fail. They saw him as a bizarre experiment from Asia, a bit of exotic color, more of a marketing product than a real athlete. Those words weren't just criticism. They were cold blades stabbing straight into the heart of a man who had spent his whole life proving his worth. Even among players, Ichiro wasn't welcomed. Plenty said straight to his face that his hitting style didn't fit MLB, that his running looked ridiculous, that his swing was lucky. Some mocked him with half-laughing, half-disdainful tones. Let's see how long he lasts. In the locker room, he heard sarcastic laughter. On the practice field, he felt scrutinizing stares. In every interview, he knew they were waiting for him to fail, to prove their prejudices right. But the season still began. And Ichiro, with silence that had become instinct, didn't refute anyone. He just went out on the field, focused to the point where his brows furrowed as if holding back invisible pain. And each crisp hit sounded like a wordless reply. He ran so fast that the cameras couldn't keep up. He hit the ball with precision that Americans had never seen. He defended as if the grass field was his own personal battlefield. But behind that explosion was not luck or magic. It was a body pushed to its limits, arms numb from repeating thousands of swings every day. Nights when he returned to his small apartment, unable to lift his wrist to open a bottle of water. There were games when he ran all the way home, always the last one to leave the field. The Seattle streetlights cast down on his exhausted face, cold light reflecting in his bloodshot eyes. Those were not the eyes of a winner, but the eyes of a warrior hiding countless wounds. Wounds of loneliness, wounds of cultural displacement, wounds of a man who had tried to the point of exhaustion but was still not trusted. He bowed his head, hands gripping the strap of his bag tightly, as if trying to keep himself from collapsing. Every step he took was a silent vow. I won't let them win. The next day, he went back out on the field, answering every doubt with dazzling hits and sprints, so fast they made the crowd leap to their feet. Every game Ichiro played was a counterattack against the prejudices he carried. And then the impossible happened. In his very first season, Ichiro won both Rookie of the Year and MVP, a feat unseen for decades, a slap in the face to everyone who had doubted him. But few understood that to achieve that, he had paid with blood, literally. The muscles in his legs tore from running too much. His hands blistered to the point where even a light touch caused sharp pain. His shoulders hurt so much that by the end of the season he couldn't raise them above his head. Every time he tried to raise his arm to wave to the fans after a win, his muscles trembled as if tearing away from the bone. But he still smiled, hiding the pain like all silent warriors have done for ages. 2001 was the year Ichiro became a global icon, but it was also the year he saw most clearly the cruelty of the world. A small Japanese man had dared to challenge all of MLB and won, but that victory didn't come from luck, nor from support. It came from the unbreakable heart of a solitary samurai who traded his health, tears, and youth just to prove that the place he stood was deserved. And from here, his life began to enter a new journey, one where the glory would shine ever brighter, but the loneliness, pain, and exhaustion would grow ever deeper. But as the glory of 2001 settled, as the entire country of America was forced to admit that Ichiro Suzuki was not just a flash in the pan, but a new force in MLB, that was also when a harsher journey began, one that even his greatest admirers didn't know whether to call a miracle or a quiet self-immolation. From 2001 to 2010, Ichiro did what no one in MLB history had done: 10 consecutive seasons with over 200 hits. Numbers as beautiful as legend, as if he had been granted superhuman strength by the gods. But no one knew that to create that great streak, Ichiro had to pay with his own body and soul a price so high he never spoke of it. Every morning, he woke up before the sun rose, his body stiff like that of a 70-year-old. Every first step felt like needles piercing his joints. But he didn't allow himself to rest. For 10 years, he had no season that was easy, no game played without full determination, and almost no true days off. His body had to operate like a machine, running continuously without missing a beat. On days he hit poorly, he couldn't sleep. On days he ran a bit slower, he punished himself with extra practice the next morning. To Japan, Ichiro was not just an athlete. He was a national treasure, a symbol, a source of pride. But because of that, the pressure from his homeland weighed on every sprint like a heavy shadow tied to his heart. One bad hit, and millions of Japanese people were disappointed. One missed play, and Japanese social media filled with critical comments. He has to do better. Ichiro isn't allowed to make mistakes. Perfection only. No one understood that perfection was not part of Ichiro. It had become his prison. The perfection the world saw was the result of thousands of times he sweated, hundreds of times he held back tears while standing in an empty locker room. Dozens of times he wondered if he still had the strength to continue. But he kept going, because Ichiro knew no other way to live than with absolute will. That strictness made him a quiet terror in the locker room, not because he was domineering, nor because he acted arrogant, but because his demeanor was too perfect, too focused, too disciplined to the point that younger teammates felt pressured just standing next to him. They didn't dare make noise when he was preparing before a game, didn't dare laugh too loudly when he was stretching, didn't dare invite him to dinner for fear of bothering him. Gradually, the distance between him and the team grew larger and larger. Ichiro had no friends, no teammates to confide in after a painful loss, no late-night calls to check on how he was doing, no one who knew about the bruises he hid under his uniform, or the nights he lay staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep from worry that tomorrow he might not maintain his form. The only person who could be called family to him at that time was his wife, who had been with him since his NPB days, Yumiko Yamamoto. But she was in Japan, and he was in America. That distance of 7,700 kilometers was not just geographical. It was the distance of two lives growing further apart. At first, both tried to stay connected. Video calls, short messages sent hurriedly before practice, brief check-ins, but gradually, Ichiro's packed schedule made everything difficult. He had no time to call home. The times he needed someone to talk to most, Japan was already asleep. And when his wife woke up, he was busy preparing for a game. That silence gradually became habit, and that habit gradually became emptiness. Ichiro began to feel his marriage like a photo kept in his wallet, precious but distant. He knew Yumiko loved him, understood him, always supported him, but he also knew he couldn't give her a normal marriage, a family, evenings together, warm meals. He was a husband in theory, but in reality, he was a figure who was always absent. Loneliness in marriage hurt more than loneliness in a foreign land. There were nights he stepped into his apartment, turned on the faint yellow light, and felt the whole world shrink into a silence heavy as stone. On the table was a plate of cold food. On the sofa was the jacket he had tossed that morning. No voice asking, "How was your day?" No laughter, no warmth of a family. Just Ichiro, and the perfection the world demanded from him. Gradually, that perfection was no longer a goal. It became a prison. He didn't dare make mistakes, didn't dare rest, didn't dare breathe deeply, didn't dare let himself be momentarily weak in a game, because just one missed ball was enough for people to conclude that his era was over. This was breaking point number 3 in the life of Ichiro Suzuki, when perfection, the thing he had pursued since childhood, turned into chains imprisoning him in absolute isolation. He stood at the peak that any athlete would dream of. But from that peak, he only saw one thing: loneliness, stretching to infinity. And just as his career reached legendary status, the cracks inside him regarding health, soul, and the desire to be a normal person began to grow larger, waiting for the day they would explode into the next tragic chapter of his life. But then, as those perfect years accumulated into numbers that made the entire country of America tip their hats, that was also when Ichiro's body began sending signals he had deliberately ignored for many years. Small signs at first, like very soft knocks on the door of his will, but over time they became powerful and brutal blows that even a steel warrior like Ichiro could no longer ignore. The most painful thing was, his body began betraying the very pride he had spent his whole life building. Throughout the years, from his peak to the phase nearing the twilight of his career, injuries became Ichiro's most feared companion. First it was his right shoulder. the one that endured hundreds of thousands of throws and swings. People called it micro-trauma, extremely small, tears in muscle, cartilage, ligaments. It sounded minor. But for an athlete who depended on speed, flexibility, and absolute precision of the shoulder, even a 1 millimeter tear was enough to ruin an entire season. Ichiro understood that, but he kept going, forcing his body to endure more than it was designed for. Then came the hips, the place that transferred power to each of his signature swings. His hips began to weaken gradually, sharp pain shooting through every time he twisted. Doctors warned that Ichiro's unique motion hitting the ball while moving forward created tremendous pressure on the hips and lower back. But how could he change a style that was tied to his very essence? How could he slow down when the whole world demanded he be fast? Ichiro listened to the advice, nodded, and the next morning still trained at the same old intensity. His spine could no longer take it either. Slightly bulging discs in his lower back, a seed that sometimes made his body feel like it was being stabbed with a knife every time he bent down to tie his shoelaces. There were mornings when he had to sit completely still, breathing deeply to ease the pain before he could even stand up. But if you asked Ichiro, he would only say, "I'm fine." Those two words were a thin armor hiding a harsher truth. He was not fine. And then, the most frightening thing, his eyes. It might not sound like an injury, but for a player who lived by visual reflexes faster than television cameras, any small change was a blow to the soul. Ichiro once said that the American stadium lights were harsher than anything he had ever known. They weren't just bright, but caused eye strain to the point where some evenings he saw the ball blur for a split second. A drop in vision, even 1%, for a player like Ichiro, was like taking away a part of himself. Many nights, Ichiro couldn't sleep, not because of worries about performance, but because of pain. Pain from the shoulder spreading down the arm, pain in the hips burning with every side turn, back pain preventing him from lying flat. He twisted and turned hundreds of times, but couldn't find a position without pain. The room was silent, only his ragged breathing, the cold ticking of the clock, and a vague fear that tomorrow he might not move as fast as before. For Ichiro, rest was not an option. Pain could never be a reason to stop. In the locker room, there were moments teammates never saw. Training sessions so heavy that Ichiro vomited in the bathroom, leaning against the wall, sighing like someone who had just escaped death. Once, a team staff member accidentally caught him slumped in a chair, face pale, cold sweat running down. The person panicked and asked, "Are you okay?" Ichiro just smiled, looked up at the ceiling and said, "I just need a few minutes." But those few minutes sometimes stretched into hours. Only when the pain eased a little did he stand up, dust off his clothes, and walk out onto the field as if nothing had happened. Few knew that there were days Ichiro played with his shoulder taped tightly with medical bandages, hips wrapped in special padding, and lower back covered in strong pain patches that numbed the entire area. But when he stepped onto the field, he ran like the wind, swung the bat with machine-like precision. No one saw the wounds. No one heard him complain. No one noticed that each swing was a cut into a body already fragile from exhaustion. Ichiro always lived as if his body was something replaceable, as if pain was something to accept, to deserve stepping onto the field. But the human body has limits, and those limits began to crumble. And, in a rare evening, returning to his silent apartment, Ichiro stood in front of the mirror and realized what he had tried to deny for years. His body was betraying him, not because it was weak, but because he had demanded too much from it. This was breaking point number 4 in Ichiro's life, when his body, the thing he placed his pride in, began to fall apart. A warrior can endure loneliness, can endure doubt, can endure separation, but when the body itself betrays, that warrior loses his last armor, Ichiro began to feel a fear he had never known. Fear that one day, when running onto the field, his body would no longer obey. But like every warrior does, he kept going, despite the pain, despite the fear, despite time gnawing away at every muscle, every tendon, because Ichiro always believed that as long as he could stand, could hold the bat, could hear the ball smack into the glove, he still had to fight. But that very stubbornness was about to lead him to one of the greatest tragedies of his life. As his body began to crack with every sprint, Ichiro still gritted his teeth and endured. But he didn't expect that the next tragedy wouldn't come from muscles or ligaments, but from the place he trusted most, the Seattle Mariners, the team that had seen him as its soul for over a decade. One afternoon in July 2012, Ichiro walked into the front office for a quick meeting. He had no idea that meeting would change his life. They said it briefly, coldly, without beating around the bush. Seattle would trade him to the New York Yankees, not because he wanted to leave, not because he had declined, but because the team wanted to rebuild, and he, the man who had dedicated his entire youth, became an old commodity on the negotiating table. When Ichiro left the office, his eyes weren't red, his lips didn't tremble, but his heart felt like someone had squeezed it hard. In the locker room that day, he quietly packed his things, each glove, each pair of shoes, each piece of a life over 10 years old. No grand farewell, no tribute ceremony, just confused and sympathetic glances from teammates who didn't know what to say to a legend being treated like outdated past. Ichiro took a flight to New York that very night. No one accompanied him, not a single team staff member saw him off. He sat by the window, watching Seattle fade into darkness, his heart aching like it was tearing. That city had been the only home he had in America. Yet now, it abandoned him as if it had never known him. Joining the New York Yankees, the massive empire, glamorous, with pressure like a storm, was like Ichiro stepping from a dark room into the middle of a Broadway stage. Everything here was 10 times harsher. In Seattle, he was the heart. In New York, he was just another name added to the endless list of superstars who had come and gone. At the Yankees, they didn't need your effort. They only needed perfection. They didn't care if you were tired, didn't care that you had once been great, didn't care that you were in pain to the point of sleeplessness. They only asked one question: what can you still do for us? From the very first practice, Ichiro felt the icy coldness of a big team. Every gaze scrutinized him. No more cheers when he entered the field. No more respect from Seattle fans. Only doubt, skepticism about his age, and unspoken questions. What is he doing here? Is he still good enough? Worse, at the Yankees, Ichiro no longer had a regular position, no longer the center of the lineup, no longer playing every day, no longer the role of leading the team. He became a rotational player, a substitute when needed, a filler when someone was injured, a minor piece in a giant machine. Every time the coach announced the starting lineup, Ichiro quietly looked at the board. There were weeks when his name didn't appear. No one explained. No one asked how he felt. No one cared that a legend was being treated like a bench player. The cruelest thing was, Ichiro couldn't complain. He was a foreign player. He was the older one. He had no right to demand. All he had left was silence, the thing that had followed him his whole life. When returning to his Manhattan apartment, Ichiro sat on the sofa, looking out at the city full of brilliant lights. But those lights weren't for him. They couldn't warm his frozen heart. He rested his head in his hands, sighing softly. I'm no longer myself. That wasn't the statement of someone about to give up. It was the confession of a man gradually losing his identity, the thing he had protected with blood, tears, and devotion for over 20 years. In Seattle, he was Ichiro. At the Yankees, he was just another Japanese player. One night, after a game he didn't play in, Ichiro walked from Yankee Stadium back to his apartment as usual. The noise of New York pounded in his ears, but he heard nothing. He just walked, heart empty. He had fought his whole life to become a legend. Yet, in the end, he stood in the biggest city in America, feeling like a lost ghost. The Yankees' empire didn't intentionally crush him. They were just cold in the way of an organization too big, too powerful, too busy to care about one individual's feelings. But that very coldness touched Ichiro's deepest wound, the wound of a child who had spent his life seeking recognition. And so, the Yankees period became one of the darkest phases of his life, a place where glory didn't shine, only loneliness, torment, and a haunting question repeating in his mind every night. If I'm no longer the Ichiro I was, then who am I? That tragedy would lead him to another battle, the final battle, against time, age, and his own fate. Leaving the Yankees, Ichiro thought he had passed the coldest phase of his life. But he didn't know that ahead was an even darker chapter, the chapter people call the fading seasons, when a legend had to struggle against the cruelty of age and the mockery he had never heard in the years before. When the Miami Marlins signed him, people didn't see it as good news. American media smirked. The old man who won't retire. Malicious comments flooded online. Why is he still playing baseball? What's the point? His fame is enough already. Make way for the young ones. If before Ichiro was underestimated because of his appearance, because he came from Japan, because of his strange style, now he was looked down on for the cruelest thing to any athlete: age. He was 41 when he joined the Marlins, an age when almost everyone had already hung up their glove. But Ichiro still came to the field every day, still trained with the intensity of his 25-year-old self, still tried every bit to hold on to what remained of his glory days. Every time he stepped onto the field, jeers echoed from the stands. "He's done! Go home, Grandpa! You're too old!" Those words stabbed into his heart, deep enough to feel like they could cut off his breath. But Ichiro didn't respond. He never responded to anyone with words. Throughout his career, the only thing that answered for him was baseball. But baseball was no longer on his side like before. If his 20s and 30s were days when he flew across the field like an uncatchable wind, now every sprint was a battle against his own body. His shoulders no longer rotated smoothly. His hips stiffened as if bound by an invisible wire. His back ached dully every time he bent over. But the most frightening was his eyes. The thing that had once been a genius's sharpest weapon now had to strain to keep up with the ball, flying under the bright but hazy stadium lights. Every hit at age 41, 42, 43 was not an achievement. It was a battle to hold on to youth. In the mornings, he arrived at the field earlier than everyone else, holding a cup of coffee, walking slowly, back stiff from pain. In the afternoons, he trained extra hours after his teammates had left. In the evenings, he returned to his small apartment in Miami, opened the fridge, took out some salad, ate simply, and sat watching the city lights reflect on the ceiling. No one knew what he thought on those nights, but perhaps, deep inside, Ichiro knew that time was gradually catching up to him. At the Marlins, he no longer played every day, no longer the center, no longer the cheers calling his name like in the Seattle days. He was like a familiar shadow stepping onto the field occasionally, remembered more as a beautiful memory than a real threat. But Ichiro didn't come to Miami for nostalgia. He came to complete the one thing still unfinished in his MLB career: 3,000 hits. That was not just a number. It was the final proof that he deserved every moment standing on American soil. And then that day came August 7th, 2016, at Coors Field. When Ichiro stepped up to the plate, the stadium was no longer Miami or Colorado. It was his entire life compressed. The harsh childhood, the lonely years in NPB, the doubt when coming to MLB, the perfect but solitary seasons, and the persistent pains no one knew about. The pitcher threw the ball. Ichiro twisted. The crack of the bat rang out, clean, sharp, perfect. The ball flew far, pinning itself into the right field corner like an arrow. He ran. The entire stadium rose to its feet as one, and when he stopped at third base, time seemed to freeze. Ichiro Suzuki, 3,000 hits, a number that only 30 people in over 100 years of baseball history had reached, a number that turned him into an MLB legend. Not just a Japanese legend. He stood there, hands on his knees, breathing heavily, but eyes sparkling. Not because of glory, not because of the milestone, but because, finally, he had done what age and pain had tried to stop him from doing. Teammates ran over to hug him. Fans applauded. Commentators shouted, but Ichiro, amid all that noise, quietly bowed his head, pressed his hand to his eyes. He cried. Not tears of victory, but tears of someone who was exhausted, yet kept going. Tears of a warrior who fought against time and won, even if only for a moment. 3,000 hits was the final glory. After that, the lights gradually dimmed. The following seasons were only faint shadows of the legend Ichiro. He sat on the bench more than he played. Pain came more than joy. But for Ichiro, 3,000 hits was never just an achievement. It was the final affirmation. I still exist. I haven't fallen yet. Yet, even though his heart hadn't surrendered, his body had begun to let go, and his life was about to enter its most painful chapter, one that even he couldn't stop. But even 3,000 hits, the last brilliant moment, couldn't keep Ichiro in the game he had devoted his entire life to worshipping forever. When time began to tighten its grip on him, when legs that once felt light as wind now felt heavy as stone, when every swing rang with fatigue more than sharpness, even the most resilient warrior had to face the inevitable. And fate brought him back to where it all began. Tokyo Dome, where he would play the final game of his life. That day, Japan wasn't watching baseball. They were watching a farewell ceremony. Fans filled every seat in the stands. Thousands of Mariners' flags waved. Children held handmade signs. Thank you, Ichiro. Elderly people wore team scarves, hands trembling because they knew they were about to witness the most painful thing. The moment a legend stepped off the grass. No one said it, but everyone knew. This was the last night. Ichiro walked onto the field, his small figure like the day he first came to America, but his steps slightly unsteady, not from fear, but because his body no longer had the strength to pretend to be strong. His eyes were deep, the wrinkles extending from the corners, telling of decades of relentless fighting. The applause rose like waves, the sound of a nation wanting to embrace their wandering son who had brought them honor, but also the sound of helplessness. They couldn't help him fight time. Throughout the game, every time Ichiro ran on the field, the crowd held its breath. He still tried to smile, still tried to appear calm, but anyone close could see his hands trembling slightly when holding the glove, see his breathing heavier than usual, see his eyes redder than normal, as if he were clinging to every last second with the only love of his life. In the final inning, when Ichiro was no longer kept on the field, Scott Servais, the Mariners' manager, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. No one heard what he said, but Ichiro paused, heart tightening, then nodded. Only then did 45,000 people understand. The moment had come. Ichiro walked slowly away from his position, each step like treading on memories of his entire life. Tokyo Dome suddenly fell into absolute silence. Not a sound. No one dared breathe loudly. Then, unexpectedly, the Mariners players knelt before him. A moment beautiful to the point of choking. For the first time in his career, Ichiro Suzuki, the man who had never bowed to pressure, never fallen to pain, stood before a long line of players bowing their heads, touching their gloves to the ground, paying tribute to him as to a warrior who had dedicated his soul to baseball. Fans cried. Players cried. The entire baseball world cried. Ichiro turned around. tried to force a thankful smile, but his hand rose to his mouth, trembling so much that even he could no longer hide it. As he walked toward the foul line, the lights shone on him, making his eyes glisten for a moment with moisture, something he had tried to hold back for so many years. But then, just as he crossed the boundary between the field and the dugout, Ichiro stopped. His entire body seemed held back by an invisible string. He turned his head to look at the field one last time, longer than usual, deeper than usual, as if he were trying to etch that image into his heart, an image he knew he would never touch again. Then he broke down, crying, no longer hidden tears falling secretly, no longer the cold restraint of a warrior. It was the choked sobs of a man forced to say goodbye to the only thing that gave his life meaning. Breaking point number 5 for Ichiro was not painful body, not failure, not old age. The greatest breaking point of his life was the moment he had to accept the truth. He could no longer play baseball. Baseball, the only companion of his lonely childhood. Baseball, the place he found the recognition that childhood had stolen. Baseball, the reason for his existence, for enduring all the loneliness, pressure, and pain for decades. And now, he was forced to leave it behind in the brilliant lights of Tokyo Dome, where cheers blended with the tears of an entire generation. That night, Ichiro didn't just leave the field. He left behind a part of his soul. A warrior had finally bowed his head not to opponents, not to doubt, but to time, the only enemy that even a legend could not defeat. And as Ichiro's figure gradually disappeared into the Tokyo Dome tunnel, the whole world understood that they had just witnessed the end not only of a career, but of a life lived fully for one single love. But Tokyo Dome was not the final pain Ichiro's life had to bear, because there was another wound deeper than any injury, colder than any fading season, more painful than any missed swing, a wound not in his body, but in his heart. That was the wound bearing the name Father. Nobuyuki Suzuki, the man who created Ichiro, but also the one who made Ichiro carry pain throughout his entire life. Without him, there would be no legend. But also without him, perhaps Ichiro would have had a different childhood, fewer tears, less loneliness, less of a suffocating burden. His father was the hot metal that forged him into steel. But that metal also burned the hands of young Ichiro for many years. From his earliest days, Ichiro knew that his father's love was not like the love of other children's parents. It didn't come with hugs, didn't come with praise, didn't come with hand-holding walks to the park. Nobuyuki's love came through repeated training sessions to the point of exhaustion, through words of reproach, through endless shakes of the head. And when Ichiro succeeded, when all of Japan admired him, when America had to bow before his genius, then a distance began to appear between him and his father. A distance so great that the two no longer understood each other, no longer could talk like before. For many years, especially after Ichiro moved to America, father and son barely stayed in touch, not because of hatred, not because of resentment, but because of two weary hearts, one heart scarred from a childhood of forced training, the other carrying clumsy pride, but not knowing how to show it. They loved each other, but didn't know how to say it. They missed each other, but didn't know how to come closer. Nobuyuki sometimes watched his son's games on TV and remained silent for a long time, his gaze distant, as if wanting to say something he had never said in his entire life. And Ichiro, though he rarely shared about his father, whenever he mentioned him, his voice always softened, not with anger, but with a simple yet deeply etched sadness. Many years passed like that. Many opportunities to talk were missed. Many apologies never formed into words. Many memories never healed. Ichiro continued fighting in America. His father continued living in Aichi, growing older day by day. Both lived like two parallel lines, once very close in the past, but never truly meeting again. Then, in 2022, when Ichiro had retired, When he began having time to look back on his life, bad news arrived like a cold slash from fate. His father passed away, without warning, without final words, without one last chance to hold hands. Ichiro flew back to Japan as soon as he heard the news, but he could only stand before the portrait, where that strict father looked at him with a gentle smile that, in real life, Ichiro had very rarely seen throughout his entire life. For the first time since Tokyo Dome, Ichiro cried like a child, not because his father had died, but because he hadn't had time to say the words he had never had the courage to say his whole life. I love you, Dad. No time to say thank you for the harsh training sessions that had made him strong. No time to say forgiveness for the tear-filled childhood. No time to say that despite the hurt, he still knew his father only wanted the best for him. All those things, years of pent-up emotions, turned to ashes in just one quiet afternoon funeral, where Ichiro stood alone before the altar, shoulders trembling slightly amid the sound of prayers. That was breaking point number 6 in the life of Ichiro Suzuki. Regret that can never be healed. A feat can be corrected. A beautiful play can be redone. A bad season can be recovered from. But a word not said in time is forever. When people asked Ichiro about his father, he only answered briefly, I carry within me a debt that I can no longer repay. Not a debt of success, not a debt of baseball, but a debt of family love, the thing that, throughout his life, he had never had the chance to fully touch. And from here, Ichiro entered the final chapter of his journey, the chapter where he had to learn to live with pains that have no cure, the pain of the body, the pain of time, and the greatest pain, the pain of things not said in time. After his father passed away, Ichiro entered his 50s with an indescribable emptiness. In the past, every morning he woke up with a goal to fight for, set a new record, push a new limit, prove something to the world or to himself. But now, when his legend had been fully written, when both parents were gone, when the grass field had closed behind him like a door that would never open again, Ichiro had to face the most terrifying thing in his life. Long days, as a man who no longer knew what he existed for. At the age of 52, every morning he woke up feeling his body as if crushed by an invisible weight. His shoulders ached like they were being pulled by steel wires. His hips stiffened like old iron joints. The bulging discs in his back felt like they were twisting, painful to the point where sometimes he had to place one hand on the wall to keep his balance. The most ironic thing was, this pain didn't come from a collision in a game, not from a slide or a glove tag, but from the consequences of a lifetime lived at the extreme, a lifetime where he had pushed himself to the limit, so that now his body was quietly demanding repayment of every debt. Some days he could get out of bed, but it took several minutes to straighten his back. Some days the pain spread to his hips, making him able to take only small steps. But the most terrifying thing was not the pain, but the instinctive longing of a warrior with no battlefield left. His body hurt because it no longer had a reason to fight, no longer had a thread tying him to a purpose big enough to overcome everything. His house in Seattle, the place he once saw as his rare peaceful refuge, now felt larger, colder, and emptier. Ichiro never had children, not because he didn't want to, but because, throughout his career, he had never had time to truly start a family. Now, in his later years, his wife Yumiko spent many months in Japan for work and family. They still loved each other, still respected each other, but the distance between Seattle and Tokyo was like a crack that gradually widened over time. At night, Ichiro lay in the dark room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick each beat. A man who had spent his youth, prime, and old age running from loneliness was finally caught by loneliness. He was so silent that even his own breathing sounded like someone else's. No children, no sound of children's laughter, no little feet running around the living room, made his sadness like a cold wind slipping into his chest. smoldering, persistent, and piercing. He didn't tell anyone this. But every time he saw other families on the street, a father carrying his child, a mother holding a little one's hand as they passed, Ichiro felt a small pain, like a needle piercing his heart. He wasn't envious, just regretful. Regretful for what he didn't have. Regretful for the years he had chosen baseball over everything else. Regretful for a life where he had given everything to one love, only to now realize he had traded away too much. Seattle, the place where he was once loved, where his name was once called, every time he stepped onto the field, now became the backdrop for fading away. Every afternoon, he walked slowly around the training field, looking at the empty seats, looking at the green grass hazy in the fog, looking at the silent dome, and he felt his heart as empty as the stadium after game time. He stood for a long time on the empty field, hands in pockets, head slightly bowed, eyes gazing far away as if searching for something he perhaps would never find again. On those gray Seattle days, skies covered in a sadness that couldn't be wiped away, Ichiro often sat alone in the highest stands, where he could look down over the entire field. That was the place where he had once run, once sweated, once heard fans cheer, once feared, once hurt but also lived most fully. But from the rain-puddled seat, Ichiro now only saw fragments of memories like old film reels, and those memories, instead of bringing pride, made him feel choked up. Because now, at 52, he began asking himself questions he had never dared think about his whole life. What did I trade too much for? Were those lonely years worth it? If baseball was my only love, then why do I feel so empty now? He loved baseball with everything he had. He traded his childhood, traded friends, traded family, traded the chance to be a father, traded his health, traded his very self. And now, on every gloomy morning, when he steps out the door with a hot cup of coffee in hand, his body aching as if turned to stone, Ichiro begins to wonder if those sacrifices ever made him happy. He does not regret his career, but he regrets the things he left behind. Loneliness makes time stretch longer. Pain makes every step heavier. And the distance between him and his beloved wife, the distance of thousands of miles, of differing time zones, of months spent apart, makes his heart shrink day by day. There are evenings when Yumiko video calls him. The two talk gently, both smile. But after hanging up, the room returns to its original terrifying silence. Ichiro sets the phone down, takes a deep breath, and sometimes tears fall without him knowing when he started crying. Not crying from muscle pain, not crying from missing the field, but because of a simple yet cruel truth. He has never known what it feels like not to be lonely. At the age of 52, when the light of fame has receded, when applause no longer rings out every night, when the world turns to find new idols, Ichiro is left only with himself, with an aching body, a heart full of emptiness, a life piled high with memories that he has no one to share. And in the darkness of those fading days, he has only one question quietly echoing like a late confession from his own soul. What did I trade too much for? That question will follow him forever, like a scar that never fades in the life of the man who lived fully, for a love that, in the end, could not keep him from loneliness. But even though the final years of his life are shrouded in darkness, even though every morning Ichiro wakes, feeling his body as if broken, even though the long, silent nights make him wonder if the years of sacrifice were worth it, there is still one thing that rises above it all, something that even he never expected. Ichiro's legacy does not lie in the numbers, not in the records, but in the hearts he ignited. In Japan, whenever people mention Ichiro's name, their voices still soften, as if speaking of a loved one who has passed but left an indelible mark. The young generation of Japanese athletes, those now conquering MLB, all carry his image in their hearts. Shohei Ohtani, as a boy, hung an Ichiro poster in his room, studying every millimeter of his swings. Yu Darvish once said, "If Ichiro hadn't gone to America, we would never have had the courage to follow that path." And not just the superstars, but the unknown players, the children swinging plastic bats in parks. The dreamy high school students all looked to Ichiro as a guiding light, not because he was perfect, but because he never gave up, even when the world turned its back, when his body betrayed him, when his heart shattered. They see in him something baseball cannot teach, something life only gives to those who dare live to their utmost, the will to rise from pain. When Ohtani signed the largest contract in MLB history, American media asked him his thoughts. Ohtani smiled and said the words that made all of Japan cry. If there was no Ichiro, there would be no Shohei Ohtani. Darvish has also admitted that whenever he feels discouraged, he watches videos of Ichiro sprinting in 2001, legs light as wind, eyes resolute, small body, but spirit so strong it gives goosebumps to the viewer. Even many American players who once doubted Ichiro upon retiring said he was the symbol of resilience, the one who made them understand baseball is not just muscle but heart. Ichiro does not accept these words. He never believes he is a legend. He only believes in practice, in work, in living honorably with the sport that nurtured him. But the world knows better than he does. From Ichiro's broken heart, hundreds of thousands of other hearts have found faith, and perhaps that is what makes his life deeper than any title. After retiring, Ichiro did not choose a life of leisure or indulgence. He did not buy yachts, did not build vacation villas in Hawaii, did not appear on glamorous talk shows. Instead, he did something almost opposite to any star. He returned to the children. Ichiro built a baseball academy for teenagers, a place with no yelling, like in his childhood, no mental violence, no forcing to the point of tears. There, he teaches them that baseball must be joy before it is achievement, that love must be greater than pressure, that a child should be allowed to laugh, something he himself rarely had in his early years. He does not teach with authority or fame. He teaches with quiet patience, with gentle eyes the world rarely saw in him during his playing days, with a softness he perhaps only dares to show when facing children, pure souls. He does not want to experience his own pain. There are days he stands for hours in the rain to correct a boy's wrist turn. Days he quietly wipes tears from a child mocked by peers. Days he rubs his eyes and sighs when seeing a boy hang his head after missing a hit because he sees his 10-year-old self in those eyes. Every time a child bursts into laughter after a beautiful hit, Ichiro smiles faintly, a rare smile, the smile of a man who has carried countless losses but still chooses to use the rest of his life to protect the innocence of others. Those children do not know that the man teaching them was once so lonely he had no hugs throughout his childhood. But they feel what Ichiro does not say in words, that they deserve to be loved. That is his greatest legacy. Not 4,367 hits, not 10 seasons of 200 hits, not 3,000 MLB hits, not Rookie of the Year or MVP, but this, a broken heart that still wants to lift those who come after. And even though Ichiro lives in the long, gloomy days of old age, even though loneliness still gnaws at him every night, even though his body hurts so much that sometimes he has to stop in the hallway to breathe, his legacy continues to shine in the young hearts running on red dirt fields across Japan, in MLB training rooms, in small parks, where children swing a bat for the first time. Ichiro turned his pain into a guiding light for the next generation. He used his own collapse to keep others from collapsing. And that is the greatest way a legend can endure. Not in the blinding lights of Tokyo Dome, but in the smiles of children who first learn what it means to love baseball. A warrior's life, a broken heart, but from those fragments, light still spreads to the world. And then, when all the world's applause has faded, when Shohei Ohtani and the new generation begin writing the next chapter of Japanese baseball, while the children in Ichiro's academy practice, clumsy swings in the fading afternoon sun, that man Ichiro Suzuki still returns to his own field every day as a habit deeper than breathing itself. At the age of 52, with no pressure to compete, no titles left to conquer, no one waiting for him to break another record, Ichiro still walks slowly on the familiar grass. The Seattle sunset falls in a melancholy orange-purple, stretching across the empty field. He bends down to pick up the old bat, the bat he still carries like part of his body. His hand lightly touches the barrel, as if touching his own memories. In that moment, he is no longer Ichiro, the MLB legend, no longer Ichiro, the symbol of an entire nation, no longer Ichiro, the man praised by the whole world. Only Ichiro, the human being, with all the fragments baseball left in his heart. He closes his eyes, breathes lightly, then whispers to himself the words not every fan could understand. Baseball took my childhood, my youth, my body, and my heart, but I am still grateful because it gave me a reason to exist. That is a confession so painful it chokes. A confession that only those who have loved so deeply they were wounded by their own love can understand. A love beautiful enough to destroy. A love that swallowed an entire life, but also saved him from utter darkness. Ichiro looks around the field, his gaze slow, as if following the invisible shadows of the past. The child forced by his father to train until tears fell, the lonely young man in NPB, under Japan's lights, the young athlete lost in Seattle in 2001, the man doubted, belittled, mocked, and the stubborn warrior fighting age to reach 3,000 hits. His entire life, from beginning to end, belonged to one thing: baseball. But as he looks back, under the gray Seattle sky, Ichiro realizes that his life is also full of emptiness that his glorious career could never fill. He has no children, no one to tell about the memories, the secret joys, the pains he hid for so many years. He has few friends, people close enough to visit his home, to check on him, to look into his eyes, and truly see the person hiding behind that calm. He also has no peace, not true peace, the kind that comes from a healed heart. His body hurts every morning, his heart hurts every night, and his soul, after decades of fighting, still carries scars no one can see. But there is one thing Ichiro knows for sure: he did not live in vain. The legacy he leaves is not in the stat sheets, not in 4,367 hits, not in the Seattle Mariners jersey hanging on the wall. It lies in the samurai spirit he brought to the entire world. Absolute discipline, endurance beyond human limits, quiet pride, and honor he preserved, even when paying with blood and lifelong loneliness. Ichiro taught people that victory is not glory over opponents, but victory over oneself. That perseverance is not a gift from heaven, but the result of a heart that has endured too much pain yet keeps beating. That loneliness is sometimes not a burden, but the price of greatness. A warrior has fallen, but the light from his worn sword still guides those who come after. The children at Ichiro's academy will continue to rise without carrying the weight of pain like he did. Otani and the Japanese MLB generation will continue breaking barriers that Ichiro shattered before them. And millions of fans around the world, whenever they mention the name Ichiro Suzuki, will remember a man who lived with everything he had. As the afternoon darkens, Ichiro walks slowly to the edge of the field, where the empty stands rise high in silence. The cold wind blows stronger, stirring a few strands of his graying hair. The last light of day dyes his solitary figure in a sad, heartbreaking orange gold. And just like that, Ichiro stands there, not a legend, not a superstar, but simply a man who has lived a life too long, too full of pain, yet still standing with his last strength. And if someone tells his story in the future, perhaps they will say, not every genius is happy, but those who endure the most often leave the longest-lasting light. Ichiro Suzuki is not just a baseball legend. He is living proof of the bitter truth that sometimes greatness and happiness never go hand in hand. Looking back on his journey through this story, we cannot help but feel a choking pain in our hearts. That slender man gave his entire life to baseball, but in return received only long, lonely nights, a body full of wounds, and a heart that was never healed. From a childhood forged by his father to the point of cruelty, to the years in Seattle and New York filled with doubt and alienation, then old age. At 52 under Seattle's gray skies and mornings when his body hurts as if about to break. Every detail tells of a man who always moved forward, even though he never escaped the darkness chasing him. The image of Ichiro in his final game at Tokyo Dome, shoulders trembling, players kneeling before him, and the moment he broke down crying when forced to leave his only love, that is one of the most heartbreaking images the sports world has ever witnessed. But in that very tragedy, we see his beauty, perseverance, honor, samurai spirit, and compassion when he opened an academy for children so they would not have to endure the pain he once did. For the people of the United States, Ichiro's journey offers a profound lesson. Success is not the answer to all loneliness. Greatness does not exempt a person from loss. And the most important thing is not what we achieve, but who we become when facing adversity. Ichiro showed us that a person's true value lies not in records, but in how they rise from pain, how they pass light to the next generation, and how they live a life true to their passion, even when the price is their entire youth and a broken heart. If the story of Ichiro Suzuki's wounded yet radiant journey has touched you, please subscribe to continue joining us on other deeply human journeys. Thank you for following to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor those who have endured so much to leave behind light that never fades.